Welcome everyone to this joint presentation of the Azure Data Services User Group and the Queensland Power BI User Group. Tonight is a Ask Me Anything type session where I'll shortly introduce our panelists. But this is an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have about Power BI or any of the other Azure data services like Synapse Analytics or Azure SQL, Managed Instance, and all of those great services that we have in the data platform side of Azure. I'll be using Slido and reading out the questions to the presenters. I will introduce our panel members in no particular order, but I'll do it in order on which they appear on my screen. We have Alice Drummond. Alice is based down in the Mornington Peninsula. She's the co-founder of DiscoverEI and is a Microsoft MVP in the data platform space. We have Greg Lowe. Dr. Greg Lowe, who is the founder and owner of SQL Down Under. Greg is also a Microsoft Regional Director and an MVP in the data platform space. We have Gilbert, who is disappeared off the screen. Gilbert Quevauvilliers, in attendees from the Queensland Power BI User Group will know Gilbert really well. Gilbert is the principal consultant at FourMoo, a consulting company, and is a Microsoft MVP as well. Unfortunately, Tanya Smith appears to have not been able to join us tonight. Tanya is from Microsoft and is a cloud solutions architect in case she does get along at any point. And we have Henry Rooney, who also works at Microsoft. Henry, I believe you had a title change in the last week. So do you want to tell us what your position is?
Yes, so was a cloud solution architect. Now I'm moving into database migration lead for the Asia region in the global black belt team.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So with a title like that, we're expecting Henry to answer all the questions tonight. For our panelists, if I could ask, I'll read out the question, and then if I can ask that you actually nominate yourself to answer if you feel like it's a question you want to answer. Obviously, if we start finding that we're getting all the questions being answered by one or two people, I might start directing questions at individuals, if that's all right. Okay, so with that, I suppose before we get going, are there any questions from any other panelists or the audience? No? Okay, just on my other screen, getting our list of questions up. Okay, so our first question is, if you had to start from scratch, how would you go about learning Power BI? What resources would you look into? Who wants to have a go at that one? Alice, yeah.
I can kick the ball off with that one. So with Power BI, there's a lot of resources out there in the community, both free and paid. A good place to start is probably the Microsoft Power BI learning pathways. That allows you to kind of pick which pathway you're interested in. I've also got I'll share a couple of links in the chat as well. I've got a link to a blog on our blog website, which has a list of all my favorite free learning resources. But probably my number one, the place where I learned Power BI was on Enterprise DNA. So they've got paid courses, but they're extremely practical. And Sam McKay walks through how to create your reports from start to finish with a focus on kind of getting to the end point. So it's less theoretical, but really just getting your hands dirty. That's probably my favorite. It is a paid course. There are free ones out there as well, but if you wanted to get started really quickly, that was really good for me.
Okay, thank you. Did you have anything to add to that, Greg? I saw you had your hand up.
Oh, no, I was actually clapping previously with Henry's comment, but yeah, I just double what Alice was saying about the learn content was. I just think it's a really, really good starting point. Okay, so.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So the next question. Is there any good strategies if you have two developers that need to work on the same Power BI file? I knew this one would come up. Gilbert, do you want to have a stab at this?
Yeah, so it's just a tricky answer. Well, there's no great answer at the moment, I guess. That's the they're always using tablet editor to try and split the model apart and bring it back together, but it's not easy. It's not a straightforward solution at the moment. I guess is the default answer.
Okay.
Always a means, but yeah, I've even looked at it, and for me, it's just a bit too much using tablet editor while you can do it. It almost comes back to if you can split it apart, you can also do source control. They almost go hand in hand, kind of thing.
Yeah.
The limitation seems to be that they don't have the ability. It's just like one lump, isn't it? I mean, they don't have the ability to sort of splinter it out into a whole lot of separate, like little JSON files or something like they do with Tabular Editor, and that's 100% needed for both multiple developers and for decent source control and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah. All right. I think everyone on the call agrees that the answer is there's no good answer, unfortunately, at this stage.
Yeah, I can't really add anything to this, but I did have a follow-on question from that one. Because we don't really work too much with multiple developers or anything like that. But I was keen to hear the panelists' thoughts about the use of XMLA endpoints. Is there potential to do that with kind of multiple developers and then kind of deploying it that way, or is that?
You could, but in theory, if you deploy a breaking change, you've got no rollback until you fix the what you've just broken. So it's almost like you even though it might not be a production XMLA endpoint, someone else trying to use it tries to deploy something else, and it might. Right, you could just break a measure, which won't really be noticed. But if you, got something else, it's just not great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You definitely can have multiple people connecting to that XMLA endpoint for sure. But I think it's just you don't know, or you could have you make a change, someone else makes a change on top of you. Now, obviously, the last one in wins. You go back, you're like, I can't see my measure, or it's not doing what I'm supposed to. And you've got no easy way of knowing, who made the change, what was that change? That kind of thing when you get with, I guess, source control and version control.
Mm.
And
I've seen such amazing messes where people are trying to merge, BIM files and analysis services, or the same thing. It's like, in fact, the one that I was working on today, they had currency data type in the tabular model, and then when it got into Power BI, it wasn't showing the formatting for the currency. And we're like, and then the weird thing is what had caused it is somebody had merged the BIM file and done some nuking in the annotations and just completely confused the product. And so basically we just set it back to decimal and set it back to currency. Then all of a sudden it comes through and we're like, oh goodness.
Yeah.
But again, that was directly from somebody confronted with a merge trying to deal with it.
I will point out that Jim McLeod has posted in the chat. Jim works for Microsoft in Canberra, and he's highlighted that there's a feature slated for preview in December. Obviously, I'm assuming, Jim, this is not under NDA, but it's dataset authoring, which is going to allow collaborative dataset editing, which sounds awesome. At least it's a step in the right direction. Thank you, Jim. All right. So that question is answered. The next question is, if we have a report with 2 dash, I'm assuming, not sure what 2 dash is, but it says if we have a report with 2 dash, how can we restrict some users from the second dash but not the first dash? Because if we use row level security, then the first dash will be filtered.
Sorry, I asked the question, but because the limitation in words, dashboards, I mean.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So it's meant to be dashboards. I don't think you can do that. I mean, someone either has access to a dashboard or not, right? And that'll, dashboards, you put it in an app typically, and someone either has access to the app or they don't. I don't think you can control that. Sorry, I shouldn't be answering the question. Over to who wants to take that one?
You might as well keep on going, Craig. You're almost there.
Yeah. Does anyone disagree with me that it can't be done?
Yeah, it's a current limitation, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, of dashboards, you'll just get the big X if you don't have access to that tile that should been filtered for particular, something like that. Yeah.
I remember talking to a customer about this quite a while ago, and there was something slated around 12 months ago to be trialed. I think they're working on another solution. So if you publish an app and you don't have access to all the reports in the dashboard, they're gonna get rid of that red X or whatever it is you see, that you're not gonna see that there's something missing. Where they are on that, I don't know. I would have to see if I can dig up the article on it. So, but I believe there is something in the pipeline on that, from what I've heard.
Okay.
Can I complete this question? Because of this issue, I divided these 2 dashboards into 2 reports with 2 data sets. And because from the first dashboard, I should read through to the second dashboard. And so with 2 data sets, I could apply different row level securities, but when I published in the app, I tested for users, and it didn't work properly for the restricted users. And
any comments from the panel?
I guess the only other thing I'd say is in the release plan, there is an option with regards to creating a Power BI app with different versions for different audiences. Doesn't really solve the row level security thing, but hopefully, I'm not sure, but it's only what I can read, but hopefully you can create different app versions. That might help solve that problem.
Thank you. Okay, next question. What if Power BI Premium P5 with 400 gigabytes of RAM capacity is not enough? What options do I have for large models bigger than 400 gigabytes?
Is the answer Azure Analysis Services?
Well, that's a good question, Henry. How big can an analysis services cube get?
Pretty big. It depends on how big your pockets are as well. So I'm not sure what the absolute top limit is on Azure Analysis Services, but it scales out quite considerably. I haven't utilized it in many years because I have to say most of my customers
400 gig, Henry.
Oh, okay. Because most of my customers actually moved off Azure Analysis Services into Power BI.
Yeah.
However, you could I suppose if the model's bigger, yeah, it's not a load type issue. I must admit at that stage I'd be trying to break it up into separate models somehow anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd also say having a look at the model, potentially using DAX Studio, the VertiPack, the analyzer to see maybe there's some columns that are just taking up a lot of space that are not needed, because 400 gigs compressed is a lot of data.
Yeah, and generally you'd think you'd be able to break up separate models a bit for different purposes or something. It doesn't all have to be built. Most of the time, doesn't have to be one big model.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never come across anything quite that size. That you're hitting a 400 gig kind of limit in the past, as you say, maybe just because by design you split it up. You're not trying to put it all into one massive model.
If I could also just add in there that the times where I have seen people go to those sort of levels, it's typically because you're including detail rows that aren't really required, or that people rarely use. So consider using direct query for those tables to a Synapse dedicated SQL pool or something that gives you pretty good performance. So that's one way to alleviate the problem, by taking the really big detailed level tables and making them direct query. All right, thank you.
Craig.
Comment there is that generally Power BI works best for strategic info as opposed to operational, and it just doesn't smell very strategic once you start getting 400 gig of compressed data. So it's just my take on it.
Shane?
Craig, we had a question early on in the chat saying how to troubleshoot data modeling issue, performance issues in the reports, any resources or tutorials that would be highly recommended. Bit of a open question, but yeah.
So could you just repeat the question? I can't see it on screen.
Oh, it's how to troubleshoot data modeling issues, performance issues in the reports. Any resources or tutorials would be highly recommended. I guess they're just looking for a starting point to how to deal with performance issues when it comes to reports.
Yeah. Who wants to take this one, Greg or Gilbert or Alice?
I don't do too. Yeah, I think Gilbert. I guess I was just going to say there is the performance analyzer inbuilt in Power BI, which is probably a good starting point. And then you can copy the query into other tools. But I don't deal with big models. So Gilbert.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I guess as you rightfully said, Alice, that's great. That's the starting point I'd start with is, which visuals will take a long time to load. Get the query from there, use DAX Studio. And I mean, a lot of the times it comes back to the model, the way the model's been designed typically, not using the big best practice star schema.
I see people also who, even though they've managed to express something in DAX, they've often done it a very awkward way. You know what I mean? Like count the number of rows in something just to work out if there is one. Like that. Yeah. These sorts of things. It's like, there are often dramatic reasons why that performs that badly sometimes.
Yeah.
I will say that Heidi has posted a link into the chat, which seems to be around troubleshooting. I haven't gone to look at the page, but thank you, Heidi. Okay, might take the next question in Slido. I can see there has been another question in the chat, but we'll come back to that one. Is there any recommendation how to choose a suitable premium capacity according to the number of active users? Reports in live query mode, 800 users at peak hour.
It depends. My favorite answer. Yeah.
I suppose Henry is Is there any official guidance that Microsoft puts out, or that we maybe aren't, well, that I'm not aware of?
I think using the admin app that you have built into Power BI, where it'll show you what reports, what data sets are consuming the resources in your environment. That's definitely the place to start, because not every report is created equally. So understanding the complexity of the report, the calculations, the visualizations that you're using in them, they'll use different amount of resources. If you're doing live query for everything, then that's potentially going to put some extra strain on, because you could be running complex calculations at runtime for every user. So thinking about those scenarios, I think, is important. But yeah, monitoring those metrics within the app is probably key.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it is interesting because those are, like Gilbert says, it's one of those it depends scenarios. I will also note that in the chat, Jim has posted another link which has some talks about the limitations of each PSKU with regards to concurrent connections and queries. So thank you for that, Jim. That may prove to be helpful for the post of that question. For anyone who's joined us a bit late, if you go back in the chat, you'll find a link to the Slido. I am seeing quite the odd question popping up in the chat. So it would be much easier for us if you used the Slido link. David, if you have a chance, maybe you could just post that again, because I think people who joined late don't see the earlier chat. Okay. Next question. What is the best way to look at execution plans for dedicated SQL pools? Finally, we have a non-Power BI question. Henry, you muted?
You're assuming I have the answer to this.
I'll jump in on that.
Yeah.
I was going to say the DMV is the easiest way I get to it, right? So there's, like in SQL Server, there's sysdm exec requests. There's sysdm PDW exec requests. And in that, you can actually, once you retrieve the requests that are running, you can then go in and pull back the query plans out of that. And that's only going to be useful, though, while it's actually happening, right, if that's the go. I posted a link there, though, which also just gives you a whole little, if this is what you're looking for, this is how you monitor it, and so on and so on.
Yeah, there's a lot of good sample queries. And another thing, which I'm not sure if the execution plan shows, Greg, is watch out for your shuffling, especially if you have multiple compute nodes, because that's where you're going to lose a lot of performance if data is being shuffled between nodes. Not something that you'd see in your operational databases, but definitely on MPP. It doesn't really matter what MPP solution you're using. That's something to keep a very close eye on. And Craig is shuffling.
Cool, thank you, Greg and Henry.
Actually, can I jump in on one other thing? Watching data skew as well. That's another really important thing on MPP. So we don't want particular data nodes being overloaded with volumes of data or overloaded with specific queries as well.
Awesome, thank you. How to become a Microsoft MVP? Could any of you experts be mentor in this case? Don't know. Who wants to take that one? I think Henry, you're the only.
I know how to lose one.
Yeah, take the blue badge. Hey.
Get a job at Microsoft. Yeah. I think I was lucky. I just happened to be there at the right time. I forget the name of that Australian Olympic ice skater. Who won?
Stephen Bradbury.
I'm the Steve Bradbury of
Steve Bradbury.
MVPs. But I think, you know, especially watching seasoned MVPs like Greg, and you know, there's a lot of people out there with a lot of years, and I think learn from example of, you know, Greg is probably the best way.
Yeah, what I'd add to that is you also have to wonder why you want to, right? I mean, that's the very first thing. I see people who say, I want to be, but then they're not particularly clear as to why, you know, and most of the better MVPs would tell you that they've been awarded for behavior they were already doing, and that they would have continued to do even if they weren't awarded. You know what I mean? So it's not like something they've specifically gone out to do. I have seen people where they go out of their way to particularly aim to do it, and fair enough, but they're also usually the ones who burn out and disappear back again sooner rather than later, you know. And so the other thing, just one thing about it as well, is that I see a thing with I'm often telling new MVPs one of the things that it does do is it helps you sort of open doors at the product groups and things like that. But the thing is, you can do that yourself, whether you're in the MVP platform or not, right? I've seen sort of people get awarded in the MVP program, and then they think like they've read the stuff and they think all this info will sort of land on them. And what they found is it isn't quite like that. And so what tends to happen is that I find it's a thing that can help you open doors better than not having it in the product groups. But if you think about the product groups, what they're interested in is what's in it for them, you know, and that's the key thing. It's a bit like when they used to have beta programs all the time. Everybody would say, I need to be in it, but then they'd provide no feedback. You know, and so the question is then why are you in it? You know, like it's you know, yes, I wanted to see something early. Well, yeah, okay, cool, but you know, what is in it for Microsoft to show you that early? You know, and I think the important thing is that even if you're not in the program, if you follow an area of interest and you contribute, particularly nowadays with GitHub and you know lots of stuff around that. There's just so many ways you can get involved in things that the product group are doing, and the MVP thing just really makes that easier, you know. But the other thing about it is that the more, if they share things with you and you keep it quiet, so where there's NDAs and things, and you don't blab about it, and if you contribute stuff back all the time, then you'll get more stuff shared with you, and so on. And that just builds up over time, you know. And as I said, it doesn't have to be in the MVP program.
Anything anyone else wants to add to that?
Yeah,
I was
actually.
just, yeah, sorry, go for it.
No, Alice, you first, please. You're one of the panelists.
I was just going to build on what Greg was saying. And definitely there's a lot of different ways that you can contribute to the community. I think it's just about being authentic and having a look around the community. Everyone has something of value that they can offer, and just try to identify what your passion area is and where you can kind of fill the gaps in the community. So say you're really interested in like Power BI development or data modeling. I'm really interested in Power BI for the environmental industry. Just identify the area that you're most passionate about, and just see different ways that you can contribute to the community without making it a burden. And like Greg said, you don't want to burn out. You don't want to contribute just to kind of tick off the kind of boxes. It has to be something that you are really passionate about. And I think that passion just shines through. And people will start seeing you as a leader in the community and a natural kind of person where you go to ask questions and things like that. So really just it's all about getting your name out there, putting your hand up for things, but making sure that you are passionate about what you're contributing as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Exactly. So just on that, following what Greg and Alice mentioned, I've spoken to a number of MPs and I actually asked them a question to them. And what I've noticed is a lot of them just wake up one day with an email saying, you've just received the MVP award. They actually didn't even know that they were up for it. So it's always a surprise to them. And what I would say is just give back to the community and then be consistent with it. And eventually you might find yourself in that position too one day. But don't have it as a goal. Just have it more of a You just want to be involved in the community and keep giving back. That's how you should really look at it. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I agree with all of those statements. I think that's spot on. Okay, next question. Let's go. Nice technical one. Are int and big int data types faster than unique identifiers as data warehouse keys for tables? I think Gilbert or Greg or Henry on this one.
I've never tested it, but just thinking about the structure of unique identifier would lead me to believe that it wouldn't be faster. Because
we still live in a world with 64-bit processors. So something that fits in a register is always going to be faster than something that requires multiple operations to do the work.
So sorry, Henry, are you saying that it wouldn't be faster? Or
unique identifier would not, no.
Oh, right. Okay, so you're saying that the int and the big int would be the quicker, the faster option. Yep.
But I've never tested it, but yeah, it just wouldn't make sense to me that it would be.
Well, if you look at the basics of processing, it can handle numbers much better than text, and effectively a unique identifier is text. So I'm simplifying it, but
it's not that bad. It's actually like a 128-bit int. And so the problem is that we still have 64-bit computers, and so just to compare two is, I mean, it's not as bad as you'd expect, because like you can imagine, if the difference is in the first 64 bits you compare, then it's not the same, right? So the thing is, you don't even have to compare the other 64. So it's not quite like that, but you can imagine that anything that just fits in a register and you can say, is that the same value as in another, that's always going to be faster. I mean, and no matter what you do.
Yep.
I think Gary has his hand up.
I have previously tested this on SQL Server, and if we remember, Henry, SQL have created a sequential UUID because of this problem.
They did actually.
Yeah.
You're after dragging something out from the back.
What it's about is when you create a
right?
B tree, of UUIDs, the B tree is going to be a scattered random distribution across the B tree, right? Because there is no order in them. But if you create a B tree over a sequential identifier like an int or a big int, then the B tree is able to be sequential, and you end up with a lovely bell curve. So you end up with this scenario where the fewer number of steps are taken inside the B tree to find your value. So you either get to, I've found the value, or I have not found the value, right? Quicker. Now, how that relates to Power BI, I do not know, but that's effectively how SQL Server works. And that's the reason why SQL Server created the sequential UUID, was to allow the B tree to be able to use the sequential part of it to be able to create indexes that performed better.
I have blog posts on this topic that talk about why new sequential ID was a silly idea. And so, okay, so the thing is, if you look at why do people use GUIDs in the first place, right? The reason people use GUIDs is so that you can create an identifier without going to a central source like a database. You can create the identifier, then you can put it in the database. You're not going to clash with something else. But the thing is, the only way you can use new sequential ID is to go to the database for it to do it. And the thing is, if you're going to go to the database to get an identifier, then why not get a big int anyway? You know what I mean? Like it doesn't add any value whatsoever. So what they were looking at is they were looking at the fact that when you had GUIDs and you had it as a clustered key on the table, you just ended up with fragmentation all over the place. And they went, well, if we do a sequential ID, then you're not going to have that problem. But the thing is, because it can only be used as a database default, then I look at it and go, well, what's the point? I mean, to me, it seems a completely pointless function Because if you're going to go to a central authority to pick up a value, why would you want to pick up something that looks like a GUID anyway?
Yeah.
Anyway, rant on.
Gary, I see you've shared your screen. Was that
I
intentional?
know. I'm now trying to turn it off. I was going to share something else, but I'm now trying to turn it off.
I
We
thought
got
this
your
was a
house- we got
funny
your house plans.
conceptual diagram.
I
of,
rarely use Teams as well.
Yeah. Greg, I can actually give you one scenario in which that would be useful. So in a previous world, and Gilbert will probably know where I'm coming from here, we had clients with multiple databases, but the data was then being aggregated up into a central data warehouse from multiple clients. So all the databases were the same structure. And obviously, if they used integers as primary keys, when you try to aggregate this all up into one table, you obviously had issues with, now suddenly you needed composite keys because it needed to be the ID and a source identifier as your composite primary key. So I'm not saying it's the only solution.
No.
But
the problem with that is new sequential ID is not guaranteed to be unique. so that's another problem, right? So all of a sudden you run into, you could then have collisions, which you might not have had, right? So this is the problem, is that when you have something that pretends to be a GUID, but it's limited to just getting bigger, it doesn't work like a GUID. You don't have the normal behaviors and stuff that you have with that. In that sort of scenario, if I had 10 sites that were centralizing the data, I mean, why not get a big int and just carve the range in 16 or 20 or something and just let them allocate the numbers like that?
Yeah, good point.
I think people also get worried. I was at a site a little while ago and they were changing all their code because they were worried about running out of big ints. And I'm like, give me a break, so they were moving it all to GUIDs because they were worried about running out of big ints. I mean, a big int is bigger than you can comprehend, let alone, you would have to choose really, really weird, starting points and steps and things to blow out a big int. I mean, they're just gigantic,
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Move on to the next question. If you're deciding on a database, what are the key benefits for using Azure over a free DB like PostgreSQL?
Am I biased if I answer that one? And Greg, you've posted so many things on Postgres and SQL, so I think I'll leave it to you. But I will say that Azure is open source as well.
Yeah, look, there's actually both things, right? There are things that I really, really like about Postgres, right? I have to say that. There's things. One of the really good things is they are focused on keeping on adding features that appeal to developers. That is not the same as what's happening in SQL Server land, right? So there are things that I wish we would add to SQL Server. So, for example, things like table inheritance and all these sorts of things. There's a bunch of stuff that would be really good. They're the sort of databases where that work is happening, right? In that sort of stuff. Or simple things like if you go to drop a column, it drops the default that's associated with the column. SQL Server, you've got to work out the name of the default and then drop that, and then you've got to, there's just a bunch of things where it is actually kind of cleaner. However, the main argument for something like Postgres used to be that it didn't have the licensing cost and stuff. But now if you look at it, the best place to run Postgres is actually in Azure, right? So, and so the weird thing now is that most of the cost is the cost of the service, not the cost of the license, is kind of what's happening. And increasingly, if you're going to run, Azure SQL DB for Postgres, it isn't going to be that different to, Azure SQL for Postgres. It isn't going to be that different to running SQL Server in terms of cost. And so otherwise, you're back to provisioning all this stuff yourself. And I just see increasingly these things, the cost of the license for that is not the issue. It's just not the issue anymore.
Yeah, and just one thing on that, because we actually had a conversation internally about this, and we're talking about Cosmos and SQL and Postgres and, all net new workload, we push towards Cosmos. And I went, absolutely not. Understand what you need, because Yeah, Cosmos NoSQL and has a bunch of APIs, but SQL and Postgres also have graph support, geospatial support, JSON support. So understand what you need, understand the engines and their capabilities, and then pick the right one for your requirements. It's as simple as that.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense.
And of course, you might already have existing Postgres code and things you've got to work with. I mean, obviously, the easiest migration is going to be to an Azure Postgres or something. Yep.
Yeah. And I think to Greg's point about the fact that if you're going to do it in the cloud, that the price difference is so minimal now between the Microsoft SQL solution, which is Azure SQL Database, and Azure SQL Database for Postgres. So you also need to then consider your existing skill sets. If everyone in your developer team knows SQL Server really well, you're not going to get any benefit by having to have them learn the slight differences with Postgres, and there are some, and vice versa.
There's quite a learning curve, right? I mean, if you're going from one to the other, there absolutely is. But the thing is, you'll find people who are just so focused on that license cost. It totally reminds me of, I used to be in discussions where people were talking about Windows and Linux, and we're in like projects that were like $400,000 projects, and they're arguing about $1,000 for the operating system license. It just becomes so irrelevant, in the new world order.
Yep. Okay. I've noticed that our next question and then one that's two down from that actually I think are pretty much the same question. So it's about any tips on using DevOps to deploy PBI files? And then the other question is from Justin is, what is the best solution or tooling to do a DevOps approach to deploying Power BI reports and data sets through pipelines rather than doing manually? Gilbert?
Personally have not used much of the deployment pipelines, to be honest. Well, they do work, and it's just it's not, for me, it's just not complete enough. It's a good start, but yeah, it's not complete. So if it's not complete, I'd rather just go back to what I know.
It was myself that put one of those questions in, right? And where I'm coming from is, so my environment, we're using Synapse, and that's obviously got Git from DevOps attached. We can branch the code. We can work in separate branches. We we pull request those branches and merge back to a collaboration branch, and then we publish to the Synapse instance. And we have Power BI Workspace attached to that Synapse instance. And then at that point, all of that code control and all of that software development lifecycle stuff just falls apart, right? There was a comment before about two people working in the same PBX file. And I think yourself made a comment about how do you roll back if someone deploys a broken version, how do you roll back to the previous version? In Synapse, it doesn't have to be Synapse, it could be something else, but because it's got Git behind it, we can roll back to the previous good commit, right? And there seems to be a gap there in being able to, trying to find a sympathetic word, professionally control the code behind our Power BI service instance.
This is my world again, amazingly. But the thing is that we already had a pretty good DevOps story, right? I mean, Azure DevOps is a great product. The integration with Git and stuff now is good. The action stuff has come like a million miles. But when the Power BI guys first did this, they just did their own thing instead of fitting in with the previous thing. And, I was in meetings where we're going, why are you doing this? But now they're back sort of looking at retrofitting it. But a big part of the problem is the stuff we were talking about before, like being able to diff and merge and do stuff like that with the files. It's a major challenge, in terms of that. What we tend to do is I tend to deploy Azure Analysis Services and just use Power BI to do the reporting, because every other part of that then I can do in a normal proper DevOps pipelines and stuff like that, and it just works. Just works good. The database projects, the analysis services projects, and so on, all that stuff works.
There's no special information about Power BI roadmaps or anything where that might be something for the future. No one's got any secret squirrel.
I think they are looking at retrofitting that story. But look, if you look at where Power BI came from, the thing is, it was the 5 minutes to wow. I mean, and they've got massive penetration through the market. There's no argument. If they had stopped and done all the enterprise stuff first, it wouldn't be where it is. It just wouldn't be there at all. And so I've got to take my hat off to them. I mean, they've got it out there, but the enterprise stuff was not the focus, of getting the product out there. And that's what they're trying to fill in now.
It would be pleasant if it had Git integration as well, right? That would be similar to ADF, and Synapse has only really got the same.
Or Azure DevOps, same, or Azure repos, right? Same thing. I like the way that Azure Data Factory works now, where basically you have the Git mode for that, and it just you build the stuff in the UI. It's tightly integrated with Git. I can roll backwards and forwards and versions and diff things. But again, a big part of the reason for that is that Data Factory pipelines can be sort of splintered out into all separate little JSON files and things like that. That's the missing thing with the Power BI ones.
Are you there, Shane, to step up while Craig is grabbing a beer or something like that?
Yeah, no worries. So I thought Craig was still there. My bad. So the next question on Slido. Oh, this is for you, Alice. DiscoverEI reports look amazing. As a modeling guy, my reports fall short on this front. Are there any tips you can share on how to get the looks?
Oh, thank you so much. You submitted that. I guess, we work mainly in the front end. So lots of these kind of back end large modeling questions are going over my head. But in terms of the kind of how to get your reports to look nice, there's a couple of key tips which I probably share. The first is think about your audience, who are you preparing it for, and try to get consistent branding. So if you get a consistent look and feel for your Power BI reports, treat it as if it is a nice Word report, a glossy brochure, a nice PowerPoint. Get those colors and styles into your Power BI reports. So you can do that by customizing your report theme or color palette. There's some really cool tools I'll share with you for doing this using powerbi.tips. You can automate lots of those things as well. Think about having a report background as well. That goes a long way just to getting that nice kind of polished look and feel. Think about less is more, probably. Try not to squeeze in too many visuals on the report canvas. Try to think about what is your hero visual and what are the supporting visuals around it. And I like to use lots of bookmarks and buttons just to try to create that kind of more storytelling aspect with your reports and guide your users to try to answer those business questions. Think about when you can add images and icons and maps, anything to support the data. So obviously some data you do need to have tables and matrices, but just think, how can you improve that to communicate the insights at a glance using things like conditional formatting, icons, color. Really try to remember that your audience is quite lazy when it comes to interpreting results. So try to aim for probably 10 to 15 seconds before they lose interest or they move on. So try to make sure that your key results are presented kind of front and center for people as well. So I guess it is really important to get the back end right, to get, I think it sounds like a lot of you spend a lot of time working in the back end, and that is really, really important. But just think about the end business user you're creating these reports for. If you're not speaking their language, if you're not presenting the data in a way that they can easily understand, if you're not spending time to collect all the requirements and put that in the report front and center, if you're not having that continuous conversation with people, then all that hard work and time and effort and automation, it kind of goes out the window if people aren't using the reports in the way that you intend them to as well. So I guess just keep the conversation going.
Very true.
Yeah, couple of tips, but I think maybe Gilbert, you do a lot of Power BI report and report design things as well.
Yeah, no, I mean you've covered off definitely a lot of the basics and all the hard work, really. I think you alluded to keeping that conversation open, is because when you ask people, oh, what reports you want to say, the answer is everything. And you can't do everything, kind of thing. Or they say, I'm not quite sure, and then you do create something which you think is meaningful, and they're like, no, I don't want that. But sometimes you've actually got to go through that process of giving them something for them to think, oh, actually, okay, and now I don't want it. It's just a bit of to and fro just to get to that point, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I often, on lots of our projects, what we tend to do is start at the end and work backwards. So start with a prototype, sketch up really quickly what the client thinks that they want, and we workshop with them before spending too long building the back end, so that you do avoid spending too many hours sifting through this data, building this awesome data model, and then they say, no, we want it to interact this way, and then you have to go back, remodel, reconfigure. So it is kind of a balance. So I think the design and the modeling, the projects we tend to work on, it is iterative. So we always loop through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Any other guys on the panel want to maybe give their insights? We're all good? Yep, sweet. Craig, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
I'm happy for you to take over again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So our next question is how to import a table into PBI desktop containing 2 columns, Azure AD groups, and users in AD groups. I'm not sure that there's a built-in connector for that, is there? Getting Active Directory information. Although I understand
you can make a REST-based connection to get to the Graph API in Azure AD. The issue there is the authentication for that, and with Power BI Desktop, I think that would still be a challenge. Be interesting if anyone else knows. We do this, but we actually do it with Data Factory and use a different identity for doing that.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat. I know Reza's got something, I think, exactly for that, where actually he uses, I'm just got it open on my other screen, he uses PowerShell to run and export that into from Azure AD into a CSV file that obviously will say sit in your data lake, but you'll then pick up and then use. Yeah, there's no direct way to get it.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is there any performance difference between using SQL Server versus dedicated SQL pool in Synapse versus SQL in Data Mart for direct query? Any takers?
No one's going to jump in. I'll just say, if you're running SQL queries against a database, SQL Server is still the better option out of the 3.
Yep. All right. Unfortunately, I think that's probably also it depends scenario, because it depends, the data volumes, because that's where dedicated SQL pools come into their own, is if you're dealing with massive, huge terabytes worth of data. But yep. We'll go with Greg's answer there, unless somebody wants to expand. Yep. Okay. Could you please share any documentation around Azure DevOps CI/CD approaches for Synapse serverless SQL pool code deployment?
Can I just
ask whoever asked that question just for a bit more detail, if the person's still online.
Yes, myself Vijay, we are using Synapse serverless SQL pool. Mainly, we are using Lake, raw, curated, enriched, and most of our data sets or raw files land in raw zone. Then we are enriching and curated, but we are creating external table between those layers. So now, when we looked at the Azure DevOps, we can't kind of basically deploy that SQL scripts behind the external table in Azure DevOps. That capability is not there. And also because our Synapse workspace is public access is disabled and we can't use the Azure hosted agents as well. There's a lot of limitation around that. And we are trying to, if the Delta Lake or Lakehouse approach is going to be kind of establishing, or that's the direction, what's the roadmap around using the Azure DevOps for that serverless SQL pool code deployment?
Is the panel okay if I try to answer that, or does one of you want
Yeah,
to try
go for it. Yeah.
I think Henry's very aware that GoRun, who I'm the data architect for, we are deploying a pure data lake environment using the Azure storage and Synapse Analytics, and this is definitely a gap in the Synapse tool at this moment in time. So, and also, so you can create a Synapse serverless pool database, and you can deploy external tables. You can deploy view code into there. You can't actually see that code from the Synapse interface at the moment. You can't right click and say script that out as a create or an alter, but you can do that if you connect via Management Studio or Data. What's the new one called? Data Studio? Azure Data Studio.
Data Studio, yeah.
Yep, you can do that from there. So then the next, when I was also involved in the question about enterprise features, right, and about code base and Git, right? So then you start to go, oh, how am I going to manage that code? Right? So number one step for us was, I need to be able to see any change. Like my go-to is it must be under source control, right? So it's got to be under source control. All those views have got to be under source control. So we created folders in our SQL. In our SQL script elements within inside Synapse to hold. So we created folders for the database name and then the schema names and each of the objects, similar to what you would have found in, say, Visual Studio data projects when we were doing those against a standard SQL database. And then we go, well, that's cool, and I can run them from there, right? So I can run the run command from there to update the update or create new, but it's very manual, right? And that's heavy load, that's hard going. If someone makes a change to one of the views on the database, very difficult to know that change. There's no way of comparing those things. So as an interim stopgap, what we've done is produced a set of stored procedures that drops those objects from the SQL pool as files into the repo, and then allows us to maintain that change control, yeah, to see whether there were differences. And then your second half of your answer was, and I feel we're just filling a gap. We're filling a gap there in what the tool, the available options for the tool. By the way, I tried just about every single database comparing tool, starting with Visual Studio to connect to the serverless instance, but there's just elements missing from the SQL implementation. That means that none of them work, and then a few of them fall over and not being able to do MFA connection, which our organization needs. I mean, we could probably set up SQL Server logins and get around the MFA bit, but so then we've gone to DevOps and we've said, okay, so there's a change, and it's just it's in the Git on a file path, right? And there's a change on there. We can use a script to connect to the database, but it still means that we've got that authentication problem. So we've now got this issue of how do we hold the authentication inside DevOps and keep that a secret? It's not good. If you want more details of how we've done it, we've managed to get it to work, but it's not nice. It's not pretty. I hope that the product will be extended to help in that regard, is my hope. It's early days for Synapse.
Okay. Sounds like that's quite an involved solution you've built, Gary. If you are willing to have that discussion with people, you know, maybe we can figure out a way to take that offline for the people who are really interested.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea, because we are using heavily serverless SQL pool, not to use dedicated SQL pool because volume is very less. We don't want to use dedicated SQL pool for smaller data sets, and the direction Lakehouse and Delta Lake, the promotions are very high from Microsoft. And if this piece of integration is not available using Azure DevOps, the whole purpose will not solve. And we are trying to deploy manually, and we are spending a lot of time to do the code deployment. Otherwise, we may go to use the SQL Server with using Deepak and using Visual Studio for the code deployment using Azure DevOps. Then again, the lake purpose will not solve if that's not the solution using Azure DevOps. Then again, lake becomes just a repository. Other than that, there's no use for lake there.
Vijay, the reason why I'm smiling is because your thought process is almost identical to what I'm going through and what our team's going through. We're going, it might be easier for us just to put up a SQL server and have a very small data file and just use external tables from there, because we could deploy it as a, we could, you know, all the tools that we would normally find available to us would be available.
That's we already done, Gary. So that's the approach we already took, and we didn't have any choice. We thought, okay, let's get the SQL Server, and we put a staging layer, and still we have dedicated SQL pool, lake, serverless, and end of the day we again back to SQL Server.
I've got a direct communication at the moment through to the product team for Synapse and the SQL serverless product team going on because of challenges that we've had, and the conversation about this was serverless is really meant, or the design principle of serverless for them, not that I really want to answer on their behalf, but for them was that it was really meant for discovery. So the idea being is I can go, I think Greg's already said that Power BI, when it first instance, was to go from 0 to hero very quickly. And the idea of that tool is to be able to go right click on a file, open row set, top 100 rows, run, there's a record set in front of me, and go from 0 to hero really quickly and give you that ability to have a SQL instance to power that. The Lakehouse is something that's overtaken them, right? So that Lakehouse model, which I think that's what you're explaining, which comes from the Databricks background, that's overtaken them, and it's obvious to use the serverless to do that if that's what you wanted to do. I think it's watch this space, but if you're interested in how we've worked around some of those challenges, then I'm happy to participate.
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Really interesting discussion. But I think in order to try and get through all the questions, we may move on now. Okay, our next question is from Julia. Where does visualization become data storytelling? Alice, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I might take this one. I guess it kind of depends. I think there's a lot of ways you could answer this, but I like to think about it as a visual. You're just looking at the visual and you're probably getting an answer. But data storytelling is where you're using a lot of visuals on the page to support whatever answer you're trying to seek, I guess. So I think, I had an example. I think kind of probably the best way to think about it is when people stop talking about the visuals on your page and stop critiquing your Power BI dashboards or reports and just get straight into discussing the data. And they're like, oh, isn't this interesting? I had a workshop the other day where we were chatting with people from a different water corporation, and they went straight past the Power BI report and started being like, oh, wow, it's really interesting. We can see how come there was a big spike in water use over this period. It turned out it was an Australia Day long weekend and a holiday hotspot. And they're like, oh, wow, I wonder what was happening with the different components of the water supply, and then they drill through to the next page, and everyone in the room was having a conversation about the data and not so much about just a visual on a page. So I think that's probably the difference between data storytelling and just visualization. It's about creating that conversation where people can get value and try to search and answer and tell a story from the data. So we try to paint the picture of data not just being a number in a table or a line on a chart by trying to tell that story using other sorts of media in Power BI. So you could think about how can you complement your data by using things like videos or images if it kind of lends itself to it. We work a lot with traditional owners and they don't really see kind of data as data, but we embed lots of videos and audio files and images and maps to really help paint that kind of data story. There are lots of different techniques you can use in Power BI for trying to tell the data story if your data lends itself to it. If you just got finance data, it could be a little bit, you might have to get a bit more creative. But yeah, that's my take on it. Gilbert or Greg, did you have any other thoughts on data storytelling or?
Nah, you pretty much covered it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you, Ellis.
Oh, no worries.
Okay. Next. Oh, sorry. I promoted the wrong one to the next question. The next question is, do you just load data from your Azure DB or do you transform it into a star schema first? I can imagine 101 answers to that question, but I'll let the panel decide who wants to answer that.
I'll take it because it's a pet topic. And so we always do build a separate thing. I tend to build it in as an Azure SQL database nearly every time, and that's worked insanely well for us. I used to see stuff all the time. I see stuff where people just pull the data straight into Power BI, and invariably they have a mess by comparison. The thing that fascinated me is they used to say you didn't need to do it, and now they've introduced data marts. And in the end, a data mart is just an Azure SQL database that's managed for you by Power BI, and which you have less control over. And I look at that and go, I mean, that's great for maybe someone who doesn't have the skills to build the database. But if you could have just built the database yourself and done it cleanly, I don't actually see any value in a data mart. But as I said, there's a whole lot of people who maybe, being able to have it auto provision for them is a good thing, in that way. But I think for anybody who has a skill there where they could build an appropriate data warehouse, that's usually a good story, right? And the other thing about it is that there's data usually coming from multiple places. In this example, we're saying from another Azure SQL database. But the thing is, invariably when I do this, there's files coming in from somewhere or some web service you got to call, and there's just stuff coming, and somehow you need to integrate that, ideally before it's sort of getting pushed into the model where you start, because doing it in Power Query and M and stuff and things, it's just not going to lead you to the same outcome. Anyway, that's me.
Yep. Anything from any of the other panelists? No. Okay. Well, thank you. We'll move on to the next question. Do any of you know how to ensure you get Oz date formats? So PBI appears to be influenced by numerous places, the operating system, display language, and or Power Platform. I'm not sure what AC stands for, but browsers, etc. Yeah, I can definitely say that this has caught me many times in the past. So don't know who wants to take that one.
I don't have any tips on this, but it has come up for me, and I think it was a browser issue. So I fixed my browser settings. But if there was a way to fix this, did you know, Gilbert or Greg? Or Greg?
They need a way to have a kind of user settings for the person who's connected, right? Because to me, the area we run into the problem with is dates, right, and so on. And because, you know, if I've got a customer who all of their workers in Melbourne, all of their people are in Melbourne, and you push it up to the Power BI service, they don't really want relative date controls and things based on UTC, right? You know, I mean, there needs to be a way for those things to understand that the user is in Brisbane or they're in Melbourne, or, you know, like, I don't understand why the service doesn't do that. And it could do exactly the same with things like date formats and stuff, because to me, you know, you really don't want a scenario where if somebody misconfigures a browser that, you know, they end up seeing all the wrong stuff, you know, really.
Gilbert, have you found any tips that you can share with people?
Yeah, no, it's Alice said, it's often the browser settings. Sometimes it's the browser settings and Windows settings. You know, it becomes a bit of a, you know, you spend a significant amount of time trying to figure out which setting is being used. Whereas Greg said, you know, if there was a way for this to just work, you know, based on that kind of thing, will make it easy.
On a similar thing, one of the things I don't like is the fact that even you have things that look right in Power BI Desktop because it's on your machine, and then you put it in the service and it doesn't look right, right? I mean, to me, that shouldn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. You should almost, in a way, if you wanted to say, no, hard code this date, it'll be like that no matter what. That kind of thing would also be helpful, be useful, but currently, there's no easy way. That's for sure.
Okay. Unfortunately, no special silver bullet there.
No, we did have a comment in the chat from Jason Cockington saying setting date by locale in Power Query allows you to combine both US and Australia dates correctly. Is that would that just fix it in the Power BI desktop, or would that would that overcome your browser settings as well when you publish to the service, do you think?
No, I've seen it. The locale works definitely in Power Query. But again, once you upload it to the service, that's managed almost by the Power BI team, and that's separate to desktop. They live in two different worlds, unfortunately. Just seen as a date in the service.
All right. Could you please share your experiences on dealing with big data in Power BI? What is the best way to deal with gigantic tables?
I don't work with big data. Maybe direct query, Gilbert?
I was going to say, first thing is define gigantic. Yeah, I noticed David asked the same question.
Yeah, is it long, is it wide? You know, is there lots of rows or lots of columns? That also can change things.
That's a good point, Gilbert. I can give an example of that. Is you know, it's easy to bring billions of rows into Power BI if they narrow, right? If the rows are narrow. I'm working with a data set at the moment which actually has directory paths in it. So, and they're unique, and there's 268 million of them in a data set. So there's no compression that'll happen because they're unique and they're long text. We don't even get to about 7 million of them before Power BI Desktop falls over. So
for me, Craig, I don't actually mind wide as long as the column cardinality is small, right?
Yes.
And so that's another thing that just sort of throws people, is that the wonderful thing about the way the compression works is as long as the number of values is small, it's just amazing, you know, what can fit in there. But the thing that kills you every time, like you were saying, are unique values. People loading up keys is a very good one. And another really, really common one is where people put date time values in there. You know, you can imagine date time values are, you know, they're going to give you so many different values in the column. You know, that's and nearly every time, if we take the routine thing we'll do is just break them out into dates. In terms of the time, again, it's a very rare thing in Power BI where you want to know to the millisecond what happened. You know what I mean? And so most of the time, there's the vast majority of reports we do, even to the nearest minute, is perfectly acceptable, right? Something like that. But again, and so we're often rounding it, taking it to the minute level before we push the value up. And then you see the size of the time columns drop absolutely dramatically, right? And the dates will go down to really, really tiny. And a little tip just from this last week is SQL Server 2022 introduced date bucket as a function, and that's now appeared in most Azure SQL databases. And so if you're using that, it's just the coolest thing for truncating seconds and milliseconds and stuff like that. So you just basically say date bucket, minute, comma, 1, comma, date time value, and that's it. And it just does it all for you. So it's wickedly cool. And so using that in a whole bunch of code already.
Awesome. Yeah, I think all very, very good points there, but I think it's getting a bit of feedback from somebody. I think all very valid points, but the bottom line is you need to look at your columns, and cardinality seems to be a big deal. All right. And
of course, what Jim was saying in there as well is that, as soon as you get to large things, you don't want to be loading the whole thing the whole time either. That's the other thing. You do need to make appropriate use of petitions or maybe incremental refreshes. We tend to just do it mostly with petitions because, again, I normally have data factory or something controlling the processing. But so like push the data in and then process. But I've got a client that I was doing work at yesterday who does individual pieces of timber coming out of timber mills, right? And for each piece of timber, they take an enormous number of readings across. I had no idea the number of readings they take across each physical piece of timber. You can imagine how much data that ends up generating. And so, but the thing is, again, you don't want to be loading that stuff all the time. We have a periodic thing that we just have a today petition, and we just keep loading the today petition all the time, or things like that. You just got to think through how the processing is going to work.
Yep, thank you. The next question is how to connect Power BI to Synapse Workspace in brackets Lake dedicated SQL pool without the need for an on-premise data gateway. I must be honest, I didn't think you needed a gateway for that. But I may be wrong.
It was a limitation. I don't know that it's gone away. Because people were asking the question, they were actually spinning up VMs just to put a gateway in it, just to connect the two products.
Sorry, this is Vijay again. Yeah, so we have a limitation there again. Like we have Azure at one end and Power BI Azure cloud services. When I try to connect Synapse to the Power BI, so you push a data set, and for some reason I can't refresh the data set. They are saying something called virtual data gateway. Again, virtual data gateway needs to be installed at the Power Platform, and I can't install the virtual data gateway at Power BI side. And there are a lot of documentation around private link hub and private endpoint, but I think nothing very concrete what needs to be done. Maybe recently, if that is something changed, that limitation, I'm not sure, but there was a limitation around one and a half month back.
So the user interface, the Synapse user interface, has a limitation of only being able to connect one Synapse workspace to one Power BI workspace. And then you've got the challenge of they need to all be inside the same, I'm not quite certain now, subscription. I don't think they have to be inside the same subscription. But they have to be verified on the same domain, like the same AD.
Greg, this Power BI is outside the Synapse. We are not trying to integrate Power BI to Synapse Workspace. My Power BI is not inside the Synapse Workspace, so that's on a different, like maybe on the Office 365 tenant, and I have Synapse on the different subscription. So now what I have done, like I have created some data sets and I push the Power BI data set to the Power BI workspace, which is outside the Synapse Workspace. Now I need to refresh my data set. So without data gateway, that I can't connect to Synapse, so that authentication fails.
So we do that all the time, except for it's more likely to be a tenant problem. I think that's the very top level, if I'm not wrong. That the Azure level is the tenant level, and then you have subscriptions inside the tenant.
Yep.
I think everything needs to be inside the same tenant for that to work seamlessly. I think you've got some kind of issue like that, rather, because we do that all the time. We will publish up to our Power BI service with the connection string. Once that's published for the first time, we'll have to go back in and edit the authentication because we want to do pass-through authentication for the user. Once we've done that, though, normally it works like clockwork, right? But
Yes,
they're all
that
inside the same tenancy.
that works. So when the public access is enabled, if you disable the public access Synapse workspace, so that doesn't work.
Sorry guys, we might need, I'll jump into this one. So we might need to move on to the next question. I can add to this one as well. I have connected Synapse to Power BI in the Power BI service, with Synapse being in the with a private virtual network as well. So I'm happy to follow it up in private to see which error you are getting there. But we just need to move to the next question. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, David. It sounds like it's possible, but there may just be some settings that need to be right. Okay, thank you. Okay, if I have a choice of SQL Server or Synapse for staging and creating a Kimball star schema, which one is better in your experience? I think, Greg, this is similar to a question you answered earlier already, isn't it? Sorry, you muted, Greg.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, to some degree. It does. I see people trying to implement Synapse in an awful lot of places where we would just put a SQL Server database, and that's not something I'm a fan of, right? For a number of reasons. Particularly once you start getting into continuous integration, continuous deployment, stuff like that, it's far faster to be able to just go and, if you need to spin up new environments or deploy things or whatever, doing that to get Synapse instances up and stuff is a much, much harder story to do that sort of thing. And most of the time, I don't see a totally compelling reason for doing it, right? It's a different story if you want to do all your transformations in Databricks or something like that. Different story entirely. But if all you're looking at doing is building a straight out data warehouse, most relational databases, a data warehouse, to me, you're better off just straight in. I would use Azure SQL Database, but in a SQL Server database, I mean, it just does a better job of being a database, yeah. And what's actually more concerning is I see people who've bought into doing it with Synapse, and then it's just not turned out to be the right answer for a lot of them. So for example, if you have higher concurrency requirements and things like that, you do start to run into issues with that. If you have a query load that isn't in a very strict sort of subset of types of queries you're trying to run, there's just many, many things where you just need to think that through. And one of the problems I see in a lot of the sites I go to is often when they have Synapse in place, because of the cost of that compared to the other alternatives, they tend to only have one, and then they're trying to do all their dev work and prod and everything over the top of each other, in that one thing, where I'm actually a big fan of being able to use database projects and have every dev have a local database and things like that, and then merge changes in later and so on. Once you start getting back to single big server thinking, that's a lot harder to do that sort of work. Anyway, that's just me.
Yep, and I think I agree with most of those, well, all of that, sorry. I don't know, Gilbert, if you've got any thoughts you want to add, but otherwise we'll move on to the next question. Yeah. Okay. Any tools or way to identify data lineage at a detailed level to track measures to the physical layer? Any takers?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm just not too sure what the physical layer is meaning. Is that meaning the visual layer, or? So if you're wanting to understand how you can track what measures are used in the different visuals, in your report. I haven't used this tool before, but I saw it because about a year ago. It's the Power BI.Tips Field Finder tool, which looks to be a tool which you can connect up to your Power BI model and have a look, and it identifies what measures are used in all the different visuals. So I'll post a link in the chat. Has anyone on the call used this one before? Maybe Gilbert or Greg? Because it looks kind of interesting. I've seen other tools out there which show you what your measures are in your Power BI reports, and you can list them all, and you can track the kind of lineage that way. But this one, it was the first one I've seen which links it to the visuals used in the reports. So Steph Bruno made this tool, which looks pretty cool.
Yeah, previously we used one of Rez's ones and stuff, but it is something I've been meaning to tackle because we do regularly now go in with the XMLA interface and pull back, all the work spaces. We pull back, the data sets that are in there, where the stuff's coming from. It's iterating over all those things and pulling apart what I can out of reports was actually the very next thing I'm sort of tackling, heading down that path, because you can certainly get to the reports that are deployed that way. So. But then you've got to pull it apart, and that's where the challenge is.
Thought we had a hand up, but clearly not. Okay. I hope we understood that question right, because it can be interpreted in different ways. But yeah, thank you, Alice and Greg. We may move on. I'm just conscious that we're running out of time now, and we still have quite a few questions in the list. So, is there a way to have file view field name changes flow to model to reports without breaking linkage? I'm guessing what that means is if you have a shared data set and you have reports connecting to that with a live connection, is there a way to have renames of fields automatically flow to reports? I hope I've interpreted that correctly, Kevin. If not, please come off mute and maybe clarify.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, that was auto-correct at its best. What we find is we tend to have views on multiple tables, and these views can be quite complex. In the views, we give nice names to fields, put spaces in the names. However, when the data model is being used and a small change is made in the view or the data model, the linkage just breaks and corrupts all the reports or the dashboards, etc. And I was wondering if there's a good way of ensuring linkage stays good.
Hey, Kevin, good to hear from you, actually.
Hey, Greg.
Listen, the thing that we do, it's not a perfect solution, but I have tried things like renaming source columns and so on in reports. Basically, because it is PBIX is a zip file, I mean, you can change its name to a zip and pull it apart, and you'll find that the data source stuff is in there and you can edit it. The only tip for putting it back together, which I think I got from Gilbert, was that you need to delete the security file that's in there before you zip it back up, otherwise it'll freak. But I've had reasonable success doing that.
Hope that's answered the question, Kevin. All right.
Sorry, sometimes we have multiple reports linking off of one data model, and that's where we find that you change one data model and you have 10 reports broken.
Yep. Yeah, I must admit I've been meaning to try and build something to automate that, because it's a really, really common problem. It's like, yeah.
Okay. What are the advantages?
I should add also, that's not a supported method for fixing it either. But yes, it is what we do.
Right. Next question is, what are the advantages of migrating Azure SQL to Snowflake? I see many companies using Snowflake and Power BI, and costs seem similar. think there may be more to that question. I just don't know how to expand my view of this. Okay, no, there's not more to that question. Given that Snowflake's not in the Azure Data Services realm, happy if people want to defer this as not applicable. But is there any experience that Greg, David, Gilbert?
Yeah, I did write a free ebook that talks about Snowflake for SQL Server people. It was done about a year and a half ago, so things will have changed a little bit there. But if you feel free, download, read that. That might give you a feeling for some of the issues there and what it is.
I'm a big advocate, for things related to Microsoft. The whole thing. I always say, think about the bigger picture. Trying to simplify how many providers your organization has to manage as well. What's the integration between the services? And that's the reason why I mostly use Microsoft tools, because I can find all the solutions in a single place. And I'm not saying that Snowflake is better than Synapse or Synapse better than Snowflake or Databricks. I'm saying, hey, I think I can find all the tool set with the same provider, and that is going to simplify a lot in regards to integration and managing providers when you think about the upcoming 5, 10 years, 15 years, right? And that's that's my approach.
Yeah, they're no slouches. The Snowflake guys, in fact, quite a few of them are ex-analysis services team people from Microsoft, right? So we know where a lot of them have come from, So, but the thing I look at is, if you ever look at comparisons, the one thing they always want to talk about is ingestion speed. And I've got to tell you, Snowflake tends to run rings around everything, pretty much, in terms of, if you have a whole bunch of Parquet files and you just want to load them up, it does an amazing job of that. However, there's an awful lot of stuff that I expect from a database and data warehouses and things that it doesn't do, right? So to give you simple examples, they have syntax there to let you create constraints, but they ignore all the constraints. Right, so things like that. There are things there that might surprise you if you're used to working with other databases. So that sort of thing. I found they had sequences, for example, but I had no way when I ingested data to reset the sequence to the next value. Like things like there were just gaping holes. And I think this is, again, because it was green. Yeah. And it's getting better. It'll get better. No question at all. But the fact that you see syntax there, for example, doesn't mean it actually works, as you'd expect.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Next questions. Your question is, what reasons would someone choose to perform data modeling in analysis services versus Power BI, or vice versa? Gilbert, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I guess I mean, at the end of the day, you still need to create the data model to begin with. I think it depends what is your end result. If you're going to use analysis services, then obviously you do the data modeling there. Or if you're using analysis services as your data set storage, if I could call it that. Otherwise, if you're just using Power BI and everything in Power BI, then do that. Obviously, the tooling is a lot better with analysis services in terms of, like we spoke of earlier, with source control, or version control and multiple working, that kind of stuff is a lot better. It's a lot more mature to get that done. Versus in Power BI, you can use Power BI Desktop, but then you could use Tabular Editor for some things. You could use, there's multiple different ways to do it in Power BI versus analysis services. It's almost a single tool that you can use to do it. So it just depends. I guess you got to start with the first question is are you using analysis services or Power BI, and then you'd go down potentially one of those routes.
Yeah, we use Tabular Editor quite a bit, and being able to edit stuff. And in the end, it doesn't matter if you're deploying to Power BI Premium or off to analysis services. In the end, yeah, you're sort of building essentially the same thing. But yeah, the experience in terms of source control, versioning, all that sort of stuff is just so much superior. The other thing not to underestimate too is I find a lot of the visual designers, it's just really slow to do stuff, you know. So for example, in Tabular Editor, I can go and write a little script and just set the date format for every column that's a date. You know what I mean? Like, and just takes a few seconds, it's done. You know, or I can go through and apply rules like I'm going to hide the many side of a many-to-one relationship, the columns there, just bang, done, all done. You know, so there's no, you know, sitting there and just go and finding every column and modifying. You know, yeah. I mean, you can do that, but it's just not the way to do it.
Yeah, good point, Greg.
Craig, you there? Craig, you're muted.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's happened to me a lot today. So what's the Microsoft roadmap around Synapse pipeline integration over Azure ADF? If we have Synapse, do we really need ADF again for ELT or ETL?
Anybody from the product team?
We use ADF for a lot of things, you know what I mean? And they're not all things that we'd use Synapse for. And in fact, even the issue connections and various things in there as well, there's still quite a bit of stuff in ADF that isn't there in Synapse. I just see them as different products, you know.
I see Jim's come online. Jim from Microsoft, since Henry had disappeared. Jim, do you want to take this one?
There's Jim.
I better represent Microsoft. Hello all. So yeah, my view, and probably the Microsoft view as well, is they are definitely two different products, as Greg mentioned. And you know, when you look at a Synapse workspace, you've got people that are doing data flows related to that Synapse workspace. But you might, you know, anyone who has access to that Synapse workspace can see all those pipelines as well. So it's entirely possible that you have a whole lot of other data pipelines outside of the Synapse ecosystem that you still want to flow through. So I kind of see it as if the pipelines are directly related to the data you're using in Synapse, then yeah, definitely keep it in Synapse, keep it all in one spot. But if you have other ones in the environment, then you know, ADF could be the way to go. So in terms of features, we're going for feature parity between the two. They're almost there now. There's just some things like not being able to share integration runtimes in Synapse, but yeah, they're pretty close now.
Yeah, I think just a comment from, do we mix the fact that Microsoft calls all of that ecospace Synapse, right? So when you look at a Synapse workspace, I've got pipelines, which is basically ADF within inside that environment. I've got SQL code. Yeah? I've got notebooks and Spark clusters. Effectively, the storage is a completely different thing. You're just accessing storage that already exists. Yeah? And then there is on-demand pools, which was where Synapse was. That was the name that Synapse was attached to originally, right? Like, there is virtually no difference between pipelines in the Synapse workspace now and an ADF. The two of them are virtually identical. In fact, we've noticed that when bug fixes or changes happen in ADF, they happen in Synapse as well at the same time. So our view as a company is we could probably just put it all in one, right? We're going to have, why be on both? We got to keep both in two different Git repositories and so on. But yeah, the question that the person asked was, what's the roadmap? So your view was they are still two separate products.
So they're treated as two separate products in that they have two different use cases. But behind the scenes, it's all basically using the same code base, and all the limitations around what you can and can't do with either ADF or Synapse is around the plumbing that connects those to the other services.
And,
So
and there's still a
definitely-
major use case for ADF because the pricings are like there's a massive difference in the pricing. So
Is there?
Yeah.
Is there a pricing difference for the aid for using pipelines? If I create a Synapse workspace.
no, but I'm saying
and
if you
do
don't have
nothing-
Synapse, you're not going to want to install that just to do things in ADF.
If I create a Synapse workspace, I get a bill of $0. If I run a ADF pipeline inside a Synapse pipeline inside a Synapse workspace, I get the same charge as running exactly the same pipeline inside an ADF workspace. I don't think there's a pricing difference between those two.
Sorry, guys. While I love pricing, I think we move on to the next question as well, because pricing is not part of the question either. And we have only 11 minutes.
David, just quickly, the point I was trying to make was I think we confuse Synapse. When we say Synapse, I think we automatically think about the big Synapse parallel data warehouse. And now Synapse is more than that.
Yeah. I do agree with that vision. Look, the last time that I created Azure Data Factory was 2 years ago. Since then, I've been creating Azure Synapse. So, and it works. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Heading to the home stretch here. What are your top 5 custom visuals for supporting your data stories?
I can take this. Another visual question. Awesome. I guess there's heaps of custom visuals out there. Depends what data story you want to share. My favorite ones, my top one is icon map. If ever you want to use a map in Power BI, icon map's amazing. It allows you to plot icons as well as custom points, polygons, and really help. I think a spatial map can always help shape your data story. Other cool ones I love is Synoptic Panel. So if you want to create interactive infographics, that's really cool. Card Browser, that's a really neat one if ever you have images or photos that you want to show with text. So it's almost like a flip card kind of gallery. I think the previews for sports cards. We use it a lot just for kind of like environmental assets. You could use it for people's headshots and showing description about what parts of the business they work, things like that. Of course, I'd have to mention Deneb. I haven't actually used it, but Daniel Marshpatrick created it and he works with us. So he uses it all the time with us, which is awesome. Really, it's like a way of creating your own custom visual inside of Power BI to really suit what bespoke visuals you would like to create. And you can do it using much, much less code than what would be required if you had to write your own custom visual. So I think the whole people doing visuals in Power BI is going crazy about Deneb. It does awesome things. I love it. HTML content, another one of Daniel's visuals. You can use that to embed any HTML into your Power BI reports, things like videos, audio, any richly formatted text as well. I think I've got so many. I love custom visuals. They're probably my top ones. Gilbert or Greg, do you have any favorites that you love to use?
You've covered them pretty much.
Yeah, you've mentioned the ones we use. Yeah. I think if people haven't had a look at the stuff at SQL BI there and all the things you can build with their stuff, that's just amazing.
Yeah, so good.
Awesome. Next question. Does Power BI work well when the data source is split between Azure Database and file DL? I'm assuming file download. And does AD-based security work between sources to ensure PII rules?
Sorry, that was a thumb problem. It's Data Lake DL.
Okay.
Sorry about
that. Yeah. Anyone who wants to grab this one? I would ask Kevin, you know, I'd suggest there's probably not enough information there. Like, you know, are you accessing the data lake via Spark clusters, via the serverless, you know, how's that being accessed? I would imagine if I was doing a consulting gig on this question right now, I'd be asking a lot of questions before being able to give you an answer.
Yeah, sorry about it's a big question. My thought was, if you have a data warehouse and you had some other form of data in a data lake, a Parquet file or something like that, my concern is, how does the security link between the two so that PII data, credit card, surname, and so forth, are maintained?
Who wants to have a go?
I don't know whether I'm the only person on here that's got an environment where we're doing data lake to Power BI using serverless, and we're also accessing the files on the data lake directly from Power BI as well on one instance. I'm not sure, there might be others in better place, but the first step is, are you doing direct query or are you importing the data into Power BI? Because as soon as you import the data into Power BI, you're not going back to the file system in the data lake anyway. If you're going back to the file system in the data lake with direct query, then you're going to use pass-through. If you're going to use pass-through authentication, then your AD user that's logged into your AAD user that's logged into the Power BI service is going to be the user ID that's passed through to the lake. And then you need to get your authentication correct, you know, so your groups, etc., correct on your lake, so that they're authenticated with the privileges. If you're going to use something like SQL serverless or SQL on demand, as it used to be called, or it still is on the name of the databases, then you could implement functions that allow you to do row-based security based on that, right? I think that's already been said. There's quite a bit in there, but if you wanted to approach me directly, I'm happy to discuss that. And because we've done a bit of this already, I think another limit, and maybe the Power BI people can answer this better, is one data set can only have one source of that. So you can end up with multiple data sets and bringing them together, right? That's what goes on at the Power BI end. I'm not the Power BI expert in my company.
Yeah, no, we were talking about using Purview to do the PII elements of it. This is not live. This is just in my head, if you like. It's in the cloud question, so to say.
I'm going to say it's a very big question, and there's so many variables. So we may take that one offline and move on. Okay, and given that it's 6:26, I'm going to call this as the last question for the night. Would you create a different zone for PII data before doing dimensional modeling in Power BI?